Hello, everybody. Welcome back to the FreeFuse Sessions interviews. I am Mike, one of the co-founders and CEO of FreeFuse. Today, we are shooting our 21st episode of the FreeFuse Sessions, and I am here with Yukimi Song, and she is one of our really appreciated users. She is not only a user of FreeFuse, but also an educator as well in the musical arts, particularly classical piano. And not only that, she is also a podcaster and has developed courses around podcasting. And of course, I can never really do it justice. So I'm going to go ahead and baton pass so you can tell the folks at home a little bit more about yourself.
Thank you so much, Mike, for having me here today. And my name is Yukimi. I'm from Brooklyn, New York. I've been living in New York for since 2007. Before that, I was teaching as a college teacher in a small college in Florida. I was teaching piano there as well. So, and then now currently I have somewhat like 20 students. It's a little bit smaller size than before, but I really enjoy teaching everybody from 6 to 7 year old piano enthusiasts. And I teach mainly from my home studio in Brooklyn. And also, I have a few international students who take lessons online from South Korea, India to Canada. So, and then I started the Piano Pod. It's called the Piano Pod. It's a podcast show, and I also stream it on YouTube. And I get to interview A-list concert pianists and composers and arrangers and digital streamers, influencers, and music educators on their top of the game. And just to be able to talk about fascinating topics about not just limited to piano and piano technique and literature, but more to do with, life, like how this classical music really should engage in this very busy contemporary modern life. And then, so yeah, it's been since I started this podcast in 2020 in August. So it's been 4 years. It's been a great 4 years. And then currently I am taking a little break from podcasting because I need to recuperate and then adjust the plan for the next season. So I'm taking a little break, but the show is coming back in September. So.
Wonderful. And there's so much to unpack there, right? And of course, as a avid lover of music myself, and someone who's been classically trained and then also worked on other instruments, it's always a near and dear subject to my heart. And one of the things that I found really interesting about what you said is you're actually teaching music online, right? And you're teaching music online to international folks. And I've talked to a lot of people who've had, I think, this misguided representation that you can't actually teach something online if you have, hardware, for example, or you have something that you have to oversee. Hey, I can look over your shoulder. I can see, sort of how you're pressing the keys, or, I can see sort of like what's your technique in terms of it. And there's various techniques in terms of how you actually place your hands on the keys, kind of different thoughts and about it, depending on who you've learned from. So I'd love to hear a little bit about how you've made that successful ability to actually teach people online for something like piano, and teaching people even across international lines here.
Yeah, that's a really great question. So, honestly, I started teaching online, you know, this is before Zoom. So, way before actually the pandemic started. So, it's like 2 or 3 years prior to the pandemic, because I had a very dear student who lived in Upper West Side of Manhattan, which is very far from where I live, although we are in the same city. So I used to go to my students' homes to teach, and then it was just impossible for me to travel. So we were like, let's try FaceTiming. we both have the same, Apple device. So let's just to see how it goes. And then, once in a while, maybe we can meet up somewhere to have a piano lesson. But in the meantime, we can try this online lesson. So that's how I started. And then it's really did the job. I was just using one camera, so I wasn't able to show really details, but it worked out. So we were enjoying. But the thing is, I think what pandemic did was really it forced us to change our mind so quickly, right? Because there was no other way of surviving. So really internet was the one of the only thing that we were able to hang on to in terms of being able to live our lives, being able to connect with others, and also to make a living. So as a piano teacher, I was forced to shut down everything. However, I was so grateful. 90% of the students were on board with online lessons, and then Zoom was one of them. And I was also able to experiment with other platforms as well. Now, during that time, also we had more time, so I was able to learn different, technology or software or, open source software like OBS. And as a friend of mine, he is a colleague of mine, taught me how to use OBS, which opened up a lot because in one scene or one, how do you say, I guess, screen, you were able to incorporate many different cameras too. So I am speaking to you like this, but I also was able to have a keyboard camera on top of one screen. So while I'm, speaking and moving my fingers, my student was able to see my fingers move. So that was a big help in terms of doing online lessons and being able to engage with students.
And I have to say how much I really appreciate the adaptability, right? Because, like you said, like if you weren't able to adapt, you weren't going to be able to survive that environment. And one of the things that I was actually teaching during that time as well. I was actually a lead instructor at Texas A&M at the time, and one of the things that we were having a challenge with even before the pandemic was they're recording all of these lectures, right? And of course, that's kind of where the initial seed of FreeFuse began with the whole AI part of it. But the funny thing was, we were sitting there. Obviously ideating when the pandemic came around, how do we actually engage students? And it's really about being able to take where someone is in their environment effectively and then actually being able to distribute information in a way that allows them to make the most of it. That's kind of how I've always conceptualized it. So I want to say how much I appreciated what you did there and really innovating, right? So when folks are looking to perhaps get themselves set up, maybe they're looking to train somebody on some kind of method of doing something, whether it's music or whether it's something else. How was it that how should someone who is getting started for the first time? What are some of the things that they should really think about? And what are some of the things that maybe you learned that you can share that would be useful for a first timer trying to get started?
Tried to get started teaching or tried to get started learning music? Sorry.
Oh, well, let's start with the teaching aspect, and then
Mhm.
let's go with the learning music aspect next.
Okay. So try to teach for the first time aspect. Okay, it's a lot to unpack here, but I think, we were taught one way. So especially for those like myself, music learning was so intense and so focused and so one-minded, like, I want to get to Carnegie Hall, or I want to get to Lincoln Center to perform, or whatever that is, or I want to go to this school to learn with this, famous teacher, or whatever that is. Then you forget what your students want. And so that's one of the biggest wake-up call for me. And I am actually still learning because I tend to go with my own agenda because, this is also important because you have to give your students incentives, and you have to give your students some sort of a framework, right? Framework that you think it works, and a framework that you learned from your teachers and from your training. So you think this is the best thing, but it may not work for every student. So this is a really learning curve for me, was a learning curve for me, but also I am still learning, and every person's needs and every person's expectations toward music is so different. So I think one of the most important things as a music educator is to give your students um, sort of context, right? Because I'm a classical pianist. I'm teaching classical music mainly. I also teach improvisation as well. But then I think giving them the context, it's because the music is old. Music is from 200 years ago, 100 years ago. Then how do these, 7, 8-year-old students who live in this modern world can relate to that? But actually, there are so many things that are in common that we can share from that time period and now. But then, so it's my responsibility to give them the context, that give them something that we can relate to, right? So, yeah, that's something that I've learned over the years.
Yeah, and you know what I really appreciate about that is the thought of really what is it that the student is trying to accomplish, right? Because a lot of people maybe have the agenda of what they think is going to be great, right? And I think that there is a certain sense of being a guide, right? And whether you put together a very structured plan, or whether you scale that and use technology to like help guide people themselves, and then there's a very important aspect to that, which is you're really trying to help someone achieve some kind of objective of what they're trying to do. And I think as part of the shaping process, it's really also about allowing them to know what is possible, right? And so, I am very much appreciative that I was able to kind of start with, I started with Bach, and then, moved up to stuff from Handel. Then I got into,
Wow.
Mozart. Yeah, Mozart and Beethoven, stuff. I know the Moonlight Sonata by heart. I don't even have to like actually, watch or read sheet music off of it at this
That
point.
is Wow, I never knew that part of you. Wow. I've known you quite a few months or so, but I never knew. Oh, that's great. I wanna hear how you do. Yeah, one of these
Yeah,
days. Yes.
no, it's funny. I would actually go and I would play the song so often, and practice for recitals and things like that, which I think is also a good opportunity to even provide goalposts along the way to some kind of objective, right? And one of the things that I found was by studying music, it actually helps me formulate creativity much more easily to this day. And I would actually encourage folks to even just get lessons in music, just so that you can be more creative in other things in your life, because it really is an outlet, right? My brother and I were classically trained, and I ended up starting a company, and he's a DJ now. He's actually producing music himself. So
That's
it's
great.
funny how those kind of paths sort of diverged in that sense. But I think that that's what's so that's what I appreciate about your thought process and approach, right? And when you're working with students, right, and helping to shepherd them along, how is it that you're able to kind of illuminate the path towards what they're doing, because they are young, right, and they may not know what it is. Maybe a parent enrolled them, but we want to deliver that lifelong love of the art, right? And so how do you kind of instill that into them, and what are some of the nice ways that you've been able to inspire them in that way?
Hmm. Really, that's also depending on the student that I work with. But I think lifelong love for music means you have to evolve with your students also. So my students, let's say they would come when they were 6 or 7 years old. And then once they hit certain age, let's say starting from 11, 12, when their age becomes two digits, that's a big deal. And they become more, their schoolwork gets much busier. Plus, they are more interested in many other things, such as, sports, to many different genres of music, obviously. So, you know, I try to have conversations with them, not just one way of teaching, but also about, like, have them curious about certain chord progressions, for example, not just limited to what's on the score, but let's use this chord progressions to make your own music or make your own arrangement of the song that you like, for example, on a practical level, but more to do with um, overall, I try to evolve or I try to grow up with my students. So when they become teenagers, they want to be more in charge of their learning. They want to be more, in charge of their lives. Then I respect that. So instead of saying you do this homework, you do this practice, but it's more to do this. What do you want to do? What do you want to do in the piano lesson? What do you want to discover? That type of approach that I want to have. Mhm.
That's beautiful too. Because I think sometimes when folks are teaching things, whether it's coaching, whether it's training people, or whether you're teaching a subject, I think sometimes there's a little bit of rigidity that I feel like doesn't allow the creativity and the critical thinking to come in.
Mm.
And what I find great about that approach is you give them a base, right? Something to start with, and then you allow the creativity to flow through. And it's kind of some of the conversations that we've had, about AI, for example. A lot of it really is allowing you to kind of start with a baseline and then build out, something that's maybe more meaningful and sounds more like you, but you get something that you can start off with. Because I think that a lot of the times, and whether it's writing an essay or whether it's, composing a piece, or whether it's, kind of coming up with a new marketing plan, the start of something is hard, even though you have the ideas, right? The ideas are there. And I think that the cool thing about, some technologies, or even just like having a process, whether you're using technology or whether you have a really good process, it's synthesizing the thought, and it's synthesizing the idea and transforming it into something that can be more fleshed out, and really just much better than the sum of what your initial thoughts were. So I really like that approach, and I can see why students would want to learn under you, because you're giving them, kind of the breadcrumbs towards what is it that you want to do, and how can I guide you towards that, right? Kind of like a trusted advisor versus, somebody telling you, no, we got to do this. We have to do this scale. We have to do, because I've had teachers like that, and it's not a fun experience. It's miserable, right? And so, the teachers I like the best, like the second, piano teacher I had, she encouraged me to bring in stuff like I did Bohemian Rhapsody. I have the sheet music to this day, like sitting in my house, and dun, 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 so I still have all of that, right? And I even got contemporary stuff like, Red Hot Chili Peppers, Under the Bridge, because there's a really nice piano part there. And even, music from video games, right? And it's that exploration and expansion that made it less of this is a stuffy thing, and more about, can I create something that really can express meaning and value to me? And I think that is part of the guidance as a teacher, to make something truly wonderful for a student, right? So I want to just say how much I appreciate your approach.
Thank you. But you know what? I've had moments where, I was a very strict and tough teacher because I did not know otherwise, because my training was like that. So to become this, to have this sort of innovative approach to teaching, it took honestly 20 plus years of teaching. That is the answer. And really, my students taught me, and they're the best teachers, I think, in order for me to be the better person, better teacher. And another thing is the parents. So when you teach young children, I also teach adults too. Half of my students are currently adult students. And so adult students are fun because I don't have to deal with the parents. So dealing with the parents also taught me the biggest lesson of my life. And, they love their children so much. They want the best thing ever for their children. And then, but even the parents, they don't know exactly what they are. So uh, you know, sometimes you have to be the teacher to the parents, and so there is a lot of negotiation between me as a piano teacher and the parents, but overall, it's been a really wonderful journey dealing with or speaking with the parents and students, and yeah. Mhm.
And what I'd like to say also is, it's funny you mentioned that, just because it's really funny you mentioned that, because you're technically managing two people, right? Like you have the student, and you're trying to manage the expectation of the parent. Um, I'm gonna reference something, and hopefully this person doesn't, remember this. But in any case, a friend of mine, they would get music lessons, right? And they had a parent who was, really just always there, right? Like the helicopter parent, right? And what would end up happening is, the teacher who was helping work through some of these lessons, they'd say, no, they have to learn this. It was actually, they were using a saxophone, right? So they were learning through that, and trying to build that up as like something they were doing. And this parent would say, no, we need to have it, they need to know this and this, like they need to be studying this type of music. And all the person wanted to do, or the kid wanted to do, was actually like just learn anything that they wanted, right? And what ended up happening was, I mean, there was all this tension, right? And it was just not fun. It turns into this thing where the parent has expectations, the teacher tries to do their best, and the student themselves are sitting there and saying, well, I mean, I'm trying, but I'm not, my heart's not into it. And then they push harder, and it turns into that, self-fulfilling cycle. So, and have you, maybe come with maybe some good opportunities to talk to, some of the folks like that, and maybe educate them a little bit, of course, on how to maybe open up to different ideas of what maybe the student can do, so they can develop that love of music.
Yeah, it's always the conversation with the parents. And so one example would be, so this parent came with this huge literature like Bach, Art of Fugue or something, which is like the late work, and I don't even touch that piece, but then they heard something on the radio and then come to me. But it's very hard for me to convince them that it's going to take years and years and decades of learning. That's one thing. Another one would be, if I ever say to young students, okay, you need to practice. The daily practice will make you a better, not only a musician, but also a better person. But every time I say this practice P word, then some folks get really upset, like as if I, I said something really, uh, you know, bad, or maybe I'm abusing them or something, but it's not. But that sort of things. The best thing is to really communicate with them all the time, and you catch them if they say, or if they try to negotiate with you without, like hopefully can get away with practice or whatever that is. Then I think in early stage you need to talk to them, uh, on the phone, or meet with them and have a conversation. Yeah.
Yeah. So flipping back, of course, to the students themselves, right? And kind of how you've been able to, sort of build up your teaching style. What I really liked about what you said was that you learned equally as much from the students. And I think there's something very important to be said there, that the way that we learn something isn't necessarily the way that someone is optimally going to learn themselves, right? And I think that sometimes taking our own experience and saying, well, this is going to work for everyone, is, I think, a little misguided. And you know at my previous university, when I was a teaching assistant, because being, of course, an undergrad, you never get to see behind the curtain, right? So seeing behind the curtain, in my second foray in school and grad school, I would see some of these conversations, and I would see that a lot of people would say, well, this is the way that I learned, right? And you're talking to people who've learned in the 80s and the 70s, right? And they're trying to push that on students, and they're wondering why it doesn't work. And it's like you have to evolve with the people and how they operate, right? So when you sort of saw that this was something that you needed to do, what was the realization that came to you that said, I do have to adapt to a certain way to communicate information to these folks a little bit more effectively? What was there a moment, or was it kind of like a transition over time where you started to say, you know what, maybe there is a new approach that I have to go with in order to be more effective?
It's hard to say. I think it's more of a gradual thing. However, so I started out my educational career. I started out as a college teacher. I was very blessed. So all my students are ready to study the piano. Even then, half of them are sort of reluctant because I taught some music students who took piano lessons or piano classes as their secondary instruments. So they were like trumpet major or vocal major. So but they have to be there because they don't want to fail the classes. So they were pretty serious, right? Then at one moment I was like, I want to become a student again. So I packed up everything. I put everything in my U-Haul trailer. I drove from Florida to New York City on my own. Then I arrived, and then I started teaching. I started my own business, which is the piano studio. I started in a very trendy area of downtown Manhattan. So coming from teaching serious students in, you know, specific setting, then going to a, pretty much, I don't know, wild. It's a wild place for me, unknown territory, teaching young children in a trendy, town of Manhattan, New York City was a big, big learning curve. And so then teaching Bach, teaching Beethoven was not the option because they were young, but also there's no connection. They don't listen to classical music, and that's okay. Even the parents of the students, they were very intelligent people, but listening to classical music was not part of their lifestyle. So that got me thinking, what does this music mean to them? you know so I also tried teaching, let's say at that time, it's still she is, but Taylor Swift was like a big, 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 big thing. She was coming out. She was still a country singer, like a sort of like a country style. So right, then country style music, the way she was composing, singing, was a very easy melody with a easy harmonization that you can do on the left hand. So it was very easy for me to use her songs and download the sheet music from a legit source, and then I was using it to teach them harmonization, how to transpose to different keys and sort of saying, but then is that the answer? Hmm, you know, it is and it is not. So yeah, it was just a gradual thing. Like every time I try something new, every time I face some challenge, I try to do something new. And then sometimes it worked, sometimes it didn't. But in the end, what do you want to accomplish as a music educator? What's the goal? What do they want? That's actually the ultimate answer to this problem or this issue. Mhm.
Hmm. Yeah, it's funny actually. I have a similar story mirroring what you moving from Florida over to New York. I kind of have well, depends on where you were in Florida. I actually moved from California to Texas to go to Texas A&M. And if you're not familiar, Texas A&M has a population of about 200,000 plus people. So going from LA to over there, when you think about the number, it's a lot, but when you go to the city, it's not. So, I was actually living in SF for a bit at the time. And I remember I had never visited the school. So, there's a whole story behind that, but long story short, they had let go of their academic advisor who was bringing me in on this on basically the stipend and sort of like the whole being a teaching assistant. And I remember thinking to myself, well, there's two ways this is going to go. I am either going to get on that plane and look out the window and think this was an awful idea, or I'm going to have a great time and everything will be fine. And of course, as we're flying over, if you've ever flown over Texas and looked out the window, everything's desolate, right? And it's just like green and it's flat. And I just remember looking out the window and the plane starting to circle going down, right? Like, in, kind of like, they're going to land. And I'm just thinking to myself, wow, there is nothing here. There's no civilization. There's nothing I can see here. I made an awful mistake. Like I've signed myself up for 2 years, right? Because I was going for my master's degree at the time, and you started having the little panic attack of I'm here and I'm going to be here for a while. But of course, when I touched down, similar to yourself, like I learned sort of like what it was like to live there. There's a lot of really nice welcoming people, and I liked it so much I stayed there for 6.5 years. Right,
Oh
so
my goodness, really?
yeah, I was there for the master's degree and then ended up getting my PhD. And of course, that was obviously during that time where, the ideas for FreeFuse would come up, right? And so I'm very grateful for the opportunity. And, I think it is nice to actually think about an opportunity and be willing to take the jump into the unknown, right? Having to learn very quickly and having to figure out things on the fly and going to a place that's just very unfamiliar, because I think it shows a lot of growth. And that's sort of what I look at the journey from, where someone is first, maybe learning from you for the very first time. You're in a sense guiding them through that journey. You're essentially guiding them through this idea of the unknown, and you're really just giving them, sort of lighting the way towards who they want to be at each stage. And then even when they get there, helping to set the next goalpost so that they can move to the next place and the next place. And I really think that that's what makes a good guide, teacher, instructor, whatever you want to call it. That's kind of what separates someone who's, that's what I think separates someone who's okay from someone who's really great. They know how to lead you to where you want to be, but then also gives you the inspiration for what can be, right? And I think that that's the difference. So I want to say how much I appreciate your story. I think it sounds a little bit like mine.
Thank you. Well, I'm trying, but yeah, I'm trying every time. Yeah, thank you.
Well, in terms of when you then started doing, the podcasting, you started in 2020, right? What was it that you saw that you said, you know what, I can do this, right? Like, I think a lot of people sometimes they want to do, creative outlets, they want to do a show. I mean, even for us, I had to think a lot before I wanted to go and start even putting this together. What was it that got you to say, I can feel confident in my ability to get this done? I can feel confident in having high quality guests. What was the process and the thought process for you? And how did you really first get that whole idea started, right? Like, how did you really sort of line everything up together?
Right. Yeah, thank you so much for asking. So going back to my first few lessons teaching in New York City, right? So I really felt a big shock. Oh my goodness, what am I going to do with this? Like, I felt a sense of huge, massive gap between what I think of music, what I think of music education versus what my students and especially the parents think about music and music learning. And then I just did not know what to do. And as I said, I've tried different strategies. So I talked to one of the professors at NYU because I was studying graduate program, was in a graduate program at NYU. I told him, I don't know what to do. And he says, why don't you do a podcast? And at that time, I was like, podcast, it's 2007. So smartphone was coming out. Apple announced that they have this iPhone and everything. And I bought the second generation. I'm very proud of. And then, so But I had an I you remember iPod, and then you scroll like this to listen to music. I had that, right? And they had this podcast stuff, but I just had no clue, and I don't know where to start. I don't know what to talk about. So that idea was back of my mind somewhere, but just didn't think about it. I was very busy with performing. I was very busy with, creating a life in New York City and graduating from NYU. So then fast forward, finally, summer 2020, as everybody did, I wanted to start a new project. I learned so many things. I learned to you know, bake something to marketing. I was into marketing stuff, and then social media marketing to then finally I thought, oh, it's time for me to start a podcast that I've been wanting to do. Then, so that's how I started, and just hoping that I could fill this gap. But maybe, it's an arrogant way of thinking, I can do this. But by bringing someone experts in my industry and talk about, how we can move this classical music industry forward. And then, honestly, funny thing is a year later, 2021, there's a Rolling Stone, one of the articles about, classical music is basically dying, and then we have to do something about it. This is a very, it's a good article, but it was became one of those really controversial article, and then I actually talked about it on the podcast. So it's been great being able to talk about the future of classical music industry, how we can engage. Is it really the classical music? Is it really dying? That sort of conversation, difficult conversation, but in a fun way.
Those are great conversations too, because for me, I mean, I haven't obviously, I haven't taken lessons in classical music in a long time, but I feel the influence of classical music in a lot of things. And, I actually, well, this is maybe just a weird thing about me, but I feel classical music, or someone, I can almost feel someone who's been trained in classical music in the work that they do that's not music, in a sense. Like I can almost sense like this is, you've had some kind of background on it, sort of by the way that they, converse and think. Because I actually think it mirrors actually a lot of sort of some of what people have experienced. I feel like, I was talking to this with someone a while back. One of the interesting things that I think is across the board, whether you talk about music artists, whether you talk about professional athletes, even whether you talk about people who are high level performers in productivity, a lot of people talk about the idea of rhythm, right? The idea of rhythm, right? And we talk about, even if you talk about your heartbeat, it's a rhythmic heartbeat, right? Like, when you talk about bad things, right? Like it's a bad heartbeat. And what I've found is it's an interesting thing to think about how we conceptualize something that's music's very foundation is a rhythm, right? It's a very foundation. It's one of the foundational pieces. Whether you're talking about 3/4 or 4/4, whether you're talking about like sort of some of the other sort of more musical elements if you're talking about reading sheet music and things like that. But I find it's really interesting that I feel like across the board we as a society of people, and how we've grown from where we were in early days to like now, I think we all understand rhythm. And I think it's like one of the things that actually can be felt in things that aren't necessarily like dance moves or playing basketball. They actually are also felt in some of our own creations. Like for example, they're felt in pieces that we create, whether it's a written piece or a musical piece or things like that. Obviously with somebody who is creating a musical piece, you can obviously kind of, sort of see some of the influences of maybe a more classical music in there. But I feel like sometimes I can almost like, read something that someone puts up and say, okay, like, this has the same rhythm and this has the same feeling of like what that would be, and it almost has the same sort of feeling as if I were to one-to-one compare this with a musical piece that you've written, it could almost be translated in such a way. It has a rhythm to it, even when I read it, right? And so I think that it's one of those pervasive things that I think we all understand, but we don't necessarily have a way to put, our thumb on it to say, oh, this is a real tangible thing, you know? So that's why I've always very much appreciated classical music. And while we don't necessarily go, people do, right? People go to a concert hall and they go to classical music stuff still to this day. Some people do opera and things like that, which is cool. And I think that might not be as prevalent as say the 1600s. I think that and maybe folks would disagree with me on this, but I feel like classical music by its nature is always just going to be ingrained in what we do because it's a specific rhythm of something, right? And it's no matter what, it's going to have its very big fans of it, and I still think it will be played out. So I don't want to say for certain it will never die, but I do want to give my love letter to classical music and how I feel like it's actually part of everything we do today.
Yeah, and then there's a reason why we call this classical music because it's classic. So it's gonna be there, no matter what. But I think as a classical musicians should be creative in many ways to reach out to more audience and educate them, whether as a concert pianist or as a content creator or as an educator. I think we have so many creative ways to reach out to the audience. And I've actually interviewed so many wonderful, amazing composers and classical performing artists and, recording artists that they are already doing. And the way they are approaching to audience, they're like, I'm not really bowing them like the old school way, but I have a microphone on the concert stage and I will, tell a story about how I discovered this piece, for example, or what's my journey as a classical pianist, and the people can really relate to, and the people start to appreciate this music better. So yeah, there are lots of ways to do. I think that's one of the responsibilities as a classical musician. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. And of course, one of the responsibilities of somebody who obviously teaches the subject as well. Um, so I know that we're obviously coming to time here, and of course I could talk about this stuff all day, but I did want to give you the opportunity to, obviously share, anything that you'd like to promote. Of course, I'll be providing all the links to any of the podcasts shows that you do, or any links that you want us to share. But is there anything you want to share with the audience before we wrap up here?
Oh yeah. So my piano the podcast name is The Piano Pod. You can just look it up on your favorite podcasting platforms. But also, I have a YouTube channel, so we do the stream on YouTube the whole entire episodes. But also, I am creating a course on FreeFuse, which is an amazing platform. I've been really enjoying posting the videos, and then I'm actually creating a course for music educators who want to become an independent music teacher, independent music business owner. So that's my goal. And then, but I'm starting out with how to start a podcast because podcasting is actually a great way to reach out to your audience. But plus, it can be a really educational platform. So that's something that I'm working on. Yeah, on FreeFuse.
Yeah, and of course, podcasts and interview series or what have you, they're always very good for getting people to know the way that you think, not only just building an audience, but really allowing people to see who it is that they're going to want to trust. And I
Right.
do believe that it is an imperative thing. And of course, we'll provide the links to all of those things as more of these things come out, and we'll also provide you all the links to all of this content as well. But I just want to say how much I appreciate you for coming on today. Thank you for the time, some wonderful stories, and some ways to really rethink how we're actually going about teaching students and how we work with people. So I just want to say how much I appreciate that. And
No,
thank you
thank
again for
you.
your time today.
Thank you so much, Mike, for allowing me to be here. Thank you.
Yep. And for those of you at home, thank you again for tuning in. We will see you next time for the 22nd episode of the Free Few Sessions. I hope you're all doing well and that you have a great rest of your day.